That's pretty cool. It's not every church that you go and get that. Right? That's good because it's World Communion Sunday. We can celebrate people who are worshiping in different ways all over the world. That's wonderful. I don't think that was the plan, but it's worked out very well today. I feel kind of silly even trying to talk to you now, but I have to. So we're still in Acts. We're in Acts this week, and then we'll wrap up Acts next week and start a new thing. At the same time, simultaneously. So be sure to be here because that's going to be exciting. But this morning we're in Acts 17 and verses 1 to 9. So listen for the word of the Lord. After Paul and Silas had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, I practice these things this morning over and over. Amphipolis and Apollonia. They came to if I just said it wrong, y'all never know. That's why you're thinking, why does she care? We don't know. These are ancient cities that no longer exist anyway, so. Okay. So he went through there, and he came to Thessalonica. This is what we need to know. He's in Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul went in, as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days argued with them from the Scriptures for 3 weeks. He was explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Messiah to suffer and rise from the dead, and saying, "This is the Messiah, Jesus, whom I am proclaiming to you." Some of them were persuaded, and they joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women. But the Jews became jealous, and with the help of some ruffians in the marketplaces, they formed a mob and set the city in an uproar. While they were searching for Paul and Silas to bring them out to the assembly, they attacked Jason's house. When they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some other believers before the city authorities, shouting, "These people who have been turning the world upside down have come here also. And Jason has entertained them as guests. They're all acting contrary to the decrees of the emperor, saying that there is another king named Jesus." The people and the city officials were disturbed when they heard this. And after they had taken bail from Jason and the others, they let them go. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. Amen.
Please pray with me. God, we pray for ourselves this day, that as we worship, we would do it well, with your blessing, that the words that I speak and the thought that we hold in our hearts would be thoughts that are pleasing to you, God. You who are our Savior and our strength for those around the world. Well, everywhere Paul goes, he seems to run into trouble. Have you noticed that? Yeah. In town after town after town, Paul's getting arrested, he gets flogged, he's chased by crowds, people are stoning him, throwing him over the cliff. They have to lift him up over the wall to help him escape. A couple of times here is one of those times where they help him escape. When you think about Paul, what kind of image do you get in your mind? Like if you're going to create a Paul in your mind, what does Paul look like? What is Paul's character? Several artists through the years have painted what their image of Paul is, what they have in their mind's eye. You know, Rembrandt painted several pictures of Paul. They're all a little bit different. A couple of them are kind of the same. Two of them, Paul's sitting at a desk. He's got a long beard, but in one of the pictures, he's very young. And in one of the other pictures, he's an old man with gray hair. He's very tired. I have that one because when I'm thinking, this is one of my favorites. Because when I think if Paul lived long, actually get right here, I mean, we don't know how old Paul was. He was most likely killed Lord is safe.
This would be the time when he would have the chance to sit at a desk and look at a book. The other one where he's young and he's sitting there and maybe he's writing a letter. This looks like not a parchment to me, but a book. But, you know, Paul was writing Romans from prison. And that would have been when he had a lot of downtime. I think when he was young, he didn't have a lot of downtime. He was just flying from one place to the other. And the questions about order and how people were to behave, they were all flying at him. And he didn't have a lot of time to think about the answers. He just had to give answers. He relied very heavily on the Holy Spirit to do that. So, you know, when I think of Paul, in my mind, what I get is this image of this like wild-haired, wild-eyed guy who's just, his robes are flying out behind him as he runs from one place to another. And, you know, I'm sure he sits and is quiet and ministers with people one-on-one or in small groups he teaches. But most of the time when we see him in the scriptures, he's like standing in front of people and expounding and espousing. And so, and if I painted Paul, he would have his mouth open. You know, that's how I picture him. But, you know, we don't know. Not that Paul was yelling all the time. I'm sure he wasn't. But, you know, he yelled a lot. Even his letters, sometimes he yelled. If Paul were an ordained person in the United Methodist Church today, I think that he would get a lot of calls from the district superintendent. He would be like, dude, I got some more emails. Can you not get along with anyone? Joette Bassler, who was my New Testament professor when I was at Perkins, she taught her classes that she hoped she would never have to invite Paul to dinner because he would give everyone indigestion. Paul did not have polite table manners. He wasn't politically correct, you know. He just went and did it. And in the organization of the church today, we have long established practices and expectations for the way that, you know, we will or we ought to worship, for the way that we go into the community. We create these frameworks that make us comfortable, and we do not want when we're taught as clergy, we go into the church and we don't, you know, disrupt things in the beginning. In the beginning, we're there to learn about the community and listen, and, you know, we don't know you. We don't know how the Lord is moving among you until we hear that from your own mouths. I don't think Paul cared too much about that. But he was also planting communities. You know, there were places where communities hadn't existed before. But, you know, he still was working within a framework, because what does the scripture say? As his custom was to go where? Into the synagogue. That's where the religious people were. He went to the church. That's where he started out, in the church. And Paul operated in a world that was not unlike ours in that way. A synagogue is very similar to the local church. Synagogues have their own rabbis, and they have church committees, and they have programs, and they're connected to a larger organization that sort of makes the rules for everyone and helps the organizational structure, and it has to be maintained, and, you know, it's not that different from what we do today. And here comes Paul, and he's just like disregarding all of that stuff. He doesn't care about political correctness or what people want. He's going into these religious communities, and he's bringing this message that is his primary message. It's the thing that everyone needs to know, that Jesus is the Messiah. And what they've been taught about this day, about the Messiah, has become reality. It's actually already arrived. They don't have to keep waiting for it, because Jesus came and he's gone again, and they missed him, and they need to know, you know. So Paul says, you know, Jesus is coming back too. There's a purpose and a plan, and it's time to act and believe. And it doesn't have anything to do with the rules that you've created for how to be in community. It's not defined by the past. This is a new thing. But, you know, it upsets people. Understandably. It'd be like if the bishop sent some 30-year-old, I tried to think of a scenario that would kind of resonate with us, and I was like, oh, if the bishop sent some 30-year-old whippersnapper in here, and they just took out all of the pulpit, the table, they did away with the choir, and they stuck a praise and worship band up here with electric guitars and drums, and said, all right, now we're going to worship, and they didn't ask y'all anything. Probably some of you would be happy about that. But my thinking is that most people probably would have something else to say. You know, like we can have so many different genres of music and worship, and it is great because we understand that different people like different kinds of music, but if we all just, you know, if we tossed it all out and some guy in skinny jeans was up here, you know, he'd be shouting, a new day has come, it's going to be great. And y'all would be like, I'm going to hit the road, buddy. Or maybe write a letter to the bishop, I don't know. But that's kind of what Paul is doing. Like he's smashing the status quo. He's suggesting a radical shift, not only in their practice, but in their belief. You know, it's not just that we're worshiping the one true God now, we're worshiping Jesus as the one true God. That's kind of weird. And now he's bringing in all these people from the outside of the church who haven't worshiped any one true God before, and they've got to learn what that means. It's chaos. So, you know, we'd be hard-pressed to make any kind of change in our faith as radical as what Paul was doing today, because it's completely new. But Paul is teaching and preaching Jesus as Messiah, and that's a concept we already accept. The point is massive shifts in the way we do things, the way we think, the way we behave. They always start with what seems like something really radical, right? If we're going to make a major shift in our life, it's going to be because something happened to us. Something maybe really bad happened to us. Maybe we lost our spouse, and now we have to just like move into this whole way of being that we don't know how to do it. We've never had to do that before. It's been a long, long time. Or maybe we got married, and now we have to learn to live with this whole new person, and we have our own way of doing things, and this person has their way. Or maybe we get a job across the country or in another country, and we have to learn new languages and customs, and, you know, it can be exciting and also kind of scary. But radical shifts like that always are radical, right? They require some kind of major event or something happening to us. So back in, you know, Paul's day, I think of John and Charles Wesley, too. You know, and their companions, as they created what they called the Holy Club. That was very radical in the beginning, not just to their group. People around them were watching the Holy Club at Oxford and going, y'all are just weird. You're weird. But then this thing started growing, and they started taking it out into the community and talking to other people about it, and it just got bigger and bigger. And these men weren't setting out to make a radical shift in the church. John and Charles Wesley and their friends wanted to help people find a faith that was deeper and richer. Instead of just going to church and thinking, well, there we go, we're done for the week. You know, they wanted to transform individual people to have a deeper faith. And look what happened. It was very radical. There weren't any Sunday school classes or, you know, Bible studies or anything like that. This is the Church of England. People go to church, the priest interprets the word for them, and they go home. And they don't have a faith that they own, typically. So John and Charles created this thing that's Bible study on steroids, I guess. You know, these classes that meet. A lot of people a lot of people, including the bishop, told Wesley to stop doing this. He told Wesley, don't be preaching in the streets, because we don't do that. This holy, what is sacred takes place in the church. Out there, out in the world, that's not sacred. That's not holy. You have to come into the church to worship, to be with God. But is that the story of God? No. God is out there everywhere. God is all over. And so Wesley, he didn't love the idea of preaching out in the public at first. He wasn't raised like that. But he recognized that the people who were out there in the field were not going to come into the church. They just weren't going to do that. And even if they did that, they weren't going to develop that deep, personal faith that Wesley hoped for everyone. They weren't actually learning how to be Christian. They were, listening to the priest. So I'm getting a little bit off track from my notes, y'all. Wesley gathered around him people who were never going to hear him preach from the pulpit. And his career in the church was completely and utterly derailed by his behavior in public. He tanked his professional career by doing what he felt God was calling him to do. I'm worried that y'all are thinking I'm going to say something radical up here, and I'm not talking about myself. I'm talking about movements in the past. It didn't matter to Wesley that he was it didn't matter to the church that Wesley was bringing massive numbers of people to faith. They wanted him to follow the rules, and he wanted people to have a relationship with the Lord. And he wasn't doing it by the book, right? So we know from John Wesley's writings that he would rather have accepted the religious establishment, that they would have conformed to his way than not. He wanted to be in the church. He was a priest. He was ordained. He wanted to do things according to the rules inside the church, but it just wasn't possible. More often than not, what he was having to do in order to be with people was something different than that. John Wesley narrowly escaped being imprisoned one time, arrested and imprisoned one time when he was in Georgia. The first time and only time he came to the Americas, here to what is now the United States. And he clashed with a powerful political family over the admiration of a young girl there who wanted to marry him. Anyway, it's a long story, but he escaped in the night, narrowly avoided being arrested, and got on a ship and went back to England and said, those crazy people over in the Americas, just let them do their thing. I'm not going to mess with them anymore. So he caused disruption. Wesley caused disruption in that little community, and that's exactly what Paul did. Except in the Roman Empire, it was a lot easier to get in trouble with the authorities than even it was for Wesley. Rabble-rousing was not tolerated. You could have free thought. That was a very accepted way. Yes, you can be a free thinker, but within reason, and don't create a mob. And that's what happened. A mob was created, and not only that, but then they accused Wesley of Paul of doing the other thing that you're not supposed to do, which is break the law. Be a free thinker within the bounds of the law and don't create chaos. And that both of those things happened. Not that Paul was actually breaking the law, but he was accused of what? Treason. He's accused of treason. That's a pretty serious crime, especially in the Roman Empire time, So suddenly we have this guy in the story, Jason. He just pops in there. And you're reading along and you go, and then Jason was there. And you're like, who's Jason? You go back a few chapters. Where did I miss? When you're reading a novel and a new character, where did I miss that? Jason's not anywhere in there before that. I think we're just supposed to know who Jason is as the readers. And here's what that tells me. A lot of people knew who Jason was. or they knew of Jason if they didn't know him directly, and which means he probably had a lot of influence, maybe some power, maybe he's wealthy, maybe he's some sort, but just because he's thrown in there like this, I feel like, that gives us some information about Jason. So Jason goes to the authorities on behalf of Paul and his companions, and it looks like he takes the money out of his own pocket and posts their bail, which is a little bit different from today, because what he did is he's not going to get his money back when there's a trial and all that. It doesn't work that way. He posts the money, and it's kind of his promise that they're not going to cause trouble anymore. I'm taking responsibility for these people, and they're not going to. So what do? We didn't read this part, but they sneak Paul and his companions out of town in the night, and they move on to the next place, which they actually find more amenable to their message anyway. But what we know is, where did we say this was in the beginning? What city are they in? Thessalonica. That's the one we know how to say. We have 2 letters that Paul wrote to the Thessalonians. Two, and he probably wrote more, but these are the only 2 that we have in our possession, which means something happened there, right? A radical shift took place, and churches got planted, and Paul went into them, and this became one of Paul's prized communities, these churches in Thessalonica. He brags about them in places. And I think that's a great message for us today, as we face all kinds of chaos in not just in our world, in our country, which is pretty obvious just by turning on the news, but also in our church. And I don't mean just this church. I don't mean we have chaos, but in the United Methodist Church. And all these people dividing up and splitting and arguing about, little minute parts of the law that really, in the long run, probably aren't going to affect the majority of the people. Or they don't, like our structure and what we're doing and all of that. They don't want to play by the rules anymore. And I get that. But what history shows us is that when radical things happen, when there's a radical change, radical shifts happen and people's behavior changes, and we see God moving. We see God doing things. And that's what I'm seeing in the church. And in all the places, this amazing work of God is just, and I don't know what it's going to be. I don't know how it's going to end up. But what I know is that if I just trust God, it's all going to work out, right? And I don't see any need for us to do anything radical here. Not promoting that at all. If I were, I would let you know what it is. But I'm trusting what God is doing, and I'm seeing things come together in a way that humans could not have done it. I'm seeing things happen here in our congregation that are beautiful and wonderful shifts and collaborations, and I believe God is at work in this place, and what that's going to look like in the long run. I mean, what is the long run? If we don't keep changing and moving and shifting, what's eternity? And how long do we have in this little spot? And how much can we possibly mess up even if we did it wrong? I think God's going to take care of us and show us, and as long as we stay focused and centered on that, just as God is working all around the world and holding all these things together, it amazes me. Paul writes that in Colossians, that Jesus will come and pull all things together. And I think about that in God's hand and that little hazelnut, and it's miraculous. It's miraculous that the world exists, that it still exists, that we haven't destroyed it yet, that we can find so many ways to harm one another. But God just keeps us all held as one. And I love that. And I do hope you might grab a hazelnut on the way out to remind you of that, to remind you that that God's holding us together. And not just here in this place, but all over the world and all the things that are happening today. And God calls us together at this table as we come to remember what Jesus has done for us. And we turn to the bread and the cup as we do every month.